Let's do that. All right, cool. Jump right in then. Hi there, I'm James Bockner, and you're listening to the first airing of The Drop on 102.7 Shop FM. As an extension of York Region's strategy for youth homelessness prevention and housing stabilization, this show is dedicated to discussing youth homelessness, risk factors, and available resources. Today, we have The Drop on the youth strategy, the Youth Council, and the By Youth for Youth project. We have two special guests here, Emma Bockner and Bonnie Harkness. Emma is chair of the steering committee, a youth council member, and a core team member of the By Youth for Youth project. Bonnie is the Chief Operating Officer at 360 Kids, a youth strategy member, and chair of the Early Intervention and Prevention Subcommittee. Welcome to the show. We're excited to have both of you here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So diving right in, let's discuss the youth strategy. What are its primary objectives and how are they being carried out? And I'll, I guess, pass this one off to Bonnie.
Sure. So I think for us, we've, and I work for 360 Kids. We've worked for many years in youth homelessness and really wanting to get to the bottom of that, we really need to look upstream at prevention of youth homelessness. And so a few years ago, with that theme in mind, we started to recognize, although we work very closely in the community with many other partners, and we work well together, we're not necessarily always as coordinated as we need to be to make the change and really prevent youth homelessness from happening in the first place. So that was really where the youth strategy sort of was born, was how do we bring the usual and unusual suspects to the table to be able to end and prevent youth homelessness in our community.
And I like what you said there about it being an upstream approach. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Of course. Well, one of the things that often happens in this sector is we put all of our focus on crisis intervention. And so really, if we're going to end homelessness, we need to go to the prevention piece. We need to stop kids from actually falling into homelessness in the first place, because we'll never, even if we have all of the crisis intervention programs, we're always waiting for kids to experience the trauma and to hit the streets before we actually are serving them in crisis. And crisis isn't good for anyone. So if we can get upstream, as we call it, get in there early, intervene early on in a young person's lives before they get to the point where their housing is at risk, then we keep kids housed, and therefore we can reduce the kind of trauma that they're going to experience, including mental health, addictions, all of those things that are often hand in hand when they come into homelessness. On the opposite side of that, I think we also need to put our efforts into aftercare. So when kids are leaving the system and they're actually getting housed, what kind of supports do we need to wrap around them to ensure that they remain housed and it doesn't become a vicious cycle? And that's another part I think is often missed, is that we focus so much on the crisis and not enough early intervention, not enough aftercare. That's where I think our system needs a bit more attention.
Absolutely. I find most organizations doing what we do focus on end of pipe solutions. So that's a very refreshing sort of take on things. And I'll ask this one of Emma. What does the division of labor look like for the youth strategy, and how many groups are there? What are they each responsible for?
So the youth strategy, it's the name of the overall project, and everything is pretty much split into sections. So subcommittees are there to allow the youth strategy to divide and conquer. Each subcommittee has their own goals, work plans, and communicates with each other to assist with projects and resources, with project resources and overlap between the subcommittees. The steering committee is basically all of our stakeholders are at the table, and again, discussing that overlap, any updates. And then youth council, we have a bunch of youth that have lived experience of homelessness or any at-risk factors that are also there to give their lived experience in order to personalize this whole experience, and also ensuring that we do have youth-informed solutions. So with subcommittees too, we have housing stabilization. That is there to ensure that youth have access to affordable housing that meets their needs and allows them to feel safe and comfortable. And that can be different for everyone. It's a very unique kind of approach. This also exists to support the supports to allow this to happen quickly, finding ways to reduce wait times and expand the options that are available, because wait times for housing, especially over COVID, has just expanded even more so. And lastly, to ensure that housing and supports are permanent, increasing education and awareness for youth around their housing rights, landlord-tenant board stuff, advocating for laws and legislations that protects tenants as well as young landlords. Our next one, we have early intervention and prevention, as Bonnie was just saying. That exists primarily to help young people reunite or stay connected with families wherever possible, of course, because we know that that's not always going to be possible, because of course everybody's situation is unique. Providing support and resources to help avoid family breakdowns and bridging gaps, empowering youth to make informed choices, using social media to educate about housing as well as human rights, and lastly, helping young people hone their resilience through mentorship and community wraparound approaches, as Bonnie was just saying as well. Next, we have elimination of structural barriers. Advocating for and implementing strategies is a big thing that we do here. We do this to ensure that youth have equitable access to resources, supports, and again, opportunities and education without restriction. Also ensuring that youth have access to income and financial resources, financial literacy, increasing employment opportunities for youth, as well as access to appropriate government funding. Next, we have transforming systems. So that is there to ensure that youth can easily access and navigate system services without facing those barriers again, providing youth with an extensive continuum of care while in the system as well as while exiting the system. And then we have advocating for policies too that support youth, and changes in policies, of course, that may put youth at risk of experiencing negative outcomes. And then lastly, we have leadership and collaboration. And our primary goals here are helping York Region to improve and integrate data collection and information, sharing systems. Working towards an integrated system with improved coordination and service delivery, engaging youth in leadership roles and opportunities, both within the project and in the greater community as a whole, and then ensuring that financial resources are allocated equitably to maximize service delivery impact. So as we both previously mentioned, there is a lot of overlap, but that is why the steering committee exists, to kind of discuss any overlap and where we might want to change certain working plans and goals. And then, as I said, we also have our youth council, which is an integral part of this whole thing. So our youth council, we meet once a week to discuss current projects, brainstorm ideas, get updates about current happenings within our youth strategy. And like I said, our council is made up of 16 members, all of whom have experienced homelessness or at-risk factors. And having a group with so much lived experience allows us to bring so many different perspectives to the table, and also that guarantees that we are approaching discussions and decision making from as many angles as we can. And each of our youth council members, they're also a member of one of the subcommittees that I just mentioned. And if it is conducive with their schedule, they also attend our bi-monthly steering committee meetings. Additionally, the Youth Council also does have some of its own initiatives and youth projects that we're working on. And then our EDI team is where they vet the work from our 5 subcommittees and from Youth Council. So basically all of the work flows through our EDI team before going to the steering committee for that final seal of approval. And lastly, like I said, the steering committee takes place bi-monthly. At these meetings, we have all of our stakeholders present. We discuss relevant news from subcommittees, Youth Council, or really anything else that needs to be brought to the attention of everyone involved in the steering committee. So as you can see, it may seem like a bit of a tedious process, but because we have so many passionate and driven individuals at the table, that makes this whole thing as easy as possible.
Okay, so that gives me a pretty good idea. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I wanted to add, and thanks, Emma, you gave a really robust, detailed explanation about sort of what we're working on now. And I maybe didn't give us enough background in the beginning, but when we first started to look at how do we end and prevent homelessness in our community, we realized that it's going to take more than just, and I mentioned the unusual suspects, it's going to take more than just one sector. It's not going to just be the homelessness providers that are going to go out there and solve this problem, because we know that the schools need to be involved from an upstream perspective. We know that, child welfare needs to be involved, that the police and emergency services often play a role, that funders, that businesses, and especially young people with lived experience. And I think, Emma, you really articulated well how youth are really embedded in this strategy. But really what our goal was to come together as a community, including youth with lived experience, to say, okay, where are the gaps? What is broken? What is our strategy? If we're going to do this, what do we need to change? And so all those things that Emma was talking about were all the areas that really fell out of that, those discussions for over, and it took us about 2 years to really have a extensive youth strategy that was based in evidence. We did a lot of research about what is done right across Canada and elsewhere, what our local problem was, how we heard from young people, as Emma said, with lived experience, to tell us that, as a system, you did this to solve this problem, but here's why it doesn't work. And that's the best kind of advice that we could ever have, is right from the users themselves to say, nice try, but here's where it all, falls down. And for me, it's been an absolute pleasure to work alongside young people, in our steering committee and our youth council both work together. So no decision is made by the steering committee without the youth council, and no youth council makes decisions without the steering committee. So that's what's really important, is the collaboration here to make these things work. And then Emma talked so eloquently about what it takes to make that happen. And it takes quite a bit. Thank you, Emma.
To sort of, I guess, synthesize from Emma's explanation of how everything works, it seems like we have the 5 initiative-based subcommittees, if I'm not mistaken. So we got housing stabilization, early intervention and prevention, elimination of structural barriers, transform systems, and leadership and collaboration. Then we have the youth council, which is sort of on its own and has its own initiatives. And each of these 6 groups work separately while communicating and occasionally collaborating with each other. And then, if I understand correctly, all of their work flows through the EDI team to be vetted for equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then the steering committee would be like the team of community stakeholders, subcommittee members, and youth who kind of give the go-ahead for projects and that final seal of approval. Is that sort of accurate?
Yeah, exactly. And like I said too, it may sound like a very tedious process. There is a lot of back and forth. However, with the help of a governance model too, and again, having so many passionate and driven individuals at the table from all different walks of life, it makes that effective communication possible.
Okay, so
and I would say that one of the things too, Emma, and you probably correct me if I'm wrong, but originally when we first started out, we saw that the youth council and the steering committee would be working collaboratively as the overall leadership table for the strategy, the ones that are driving the strategy. What we didn't, and we always thought there would be subcommittees and working groups that would actually take on some of the initiatives that fell out of the strategy, which is those 5 categories you talked about. But what we didn't realize, and this is where really passionate young people come into play, is that our youth council themselves actually took on initiatives from our strategy and said, so our strategy identified different initiatives that we could do to further our goal. And the youth council said, hey, we want to take that one on. We want to take this project on. And that's where this For Youth by Youth project started to come to life. So it was, I think, our intention from the beginning wasn't that youth council members would take on projects of their own necessarily. They would be taking on the whole project of the youth strategy just alongside the steering committee members, like as part of steering committee. But because they are so passionate and dedicated, they're actually taking on some of the work themselves. And then in other cases, we have some steering committee members and youth council members that are forming smaller working groups on other initiatives. So it's really interesting how it all falls out, and much more complicated than I think people imagine.
Yeah, and go ahead, James.
Sorry, it's hard to not cut each other off with the lag through the Zoom. I was just going to say, my next sort of question here is, how was the youth strategy created? And is it a 360 Kids initiative, or is it part of a larger collaborative? And I guess I would pose this to Bonnie.
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely not. So that's one of the things, very interestingly, when you do a collective impact approach, and that's really what we're trying to do here. Typically that's done, the drivers of that, or what we call the backbone or the administrators of that, would likely be municipalities or someone that sort of has a overarching goal across the entire region. For a charity themselves to provide that support and be a player at the table is often difficult, because it can be seen as this might be a 360 Kids initiative or a 360 Kids project, and it certainly isn't. We are only one player at that table, although we absolutely are passionate about the work and provide that administrative support to the project. It's really a community collective impact. So all of our stakeholders are there, and I often joke saying that, you know, I'm very passionate and love to speak. And sometimes I have to, you know, remember, just to be clear, that I'm just a player at the table here. You know, we don't own this. The community owns this. And we have some stake in the game, some skin in the game, so to speak, because we work in youth homelessness, but it's more about working as a community to change systems than it is about one organization, you know, leading a cause.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess I'll ask this of Emma. Are there ways for people outside of the youth strategy to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, the first thing that I would think of would be designated dollars, because that is not a luxury. That is a luxury that we don't have. So monetary donations would be very helpful to support us in our working group projects, especially. This money can go towards initiatives for example, transforming system subcommittees, and we could fund the materials for things like life skill classes, where we'd show youth how to cook, for example. Something else too, youth involvement is so crucial in my eyes, because young people's voices are needed in our subcommittees and our steering committee too. And a lot of the change we want to make is more likely to occur with political willingness as well. So the involvement of politicians would also be a crucial part of the strategy. Yeah, as I'm sure you can gather from what I'm saying, there are a multitude of ways for people to become involved.
Definitely. And what you just mentioned too about like potentially funding life skills classes, I just want to outline here, that is one of the initiatives being carried out by the Transform Systems Subcommittee, which I believe is called Grannies in the Cloud. And it's one that I'm actually really excited about. We're going to be gathering, sort of cultivating a setting where we can have intergenerational collaboration, and we can have the older generation not necessarily teaching the young generation, but imparting some wisdom in a process where they're kind of learning with them. And I think that's such a sort of a beautiful way to deliver life skills classes. So you're saying donations might be a good way to get involved with the strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, designated dollars, they're not a luxury that we do have. And to your point too, I think the opportunity for older generations to be working with younger generations, I feel like that is such a good opportunity to break down some potential barriers and maybe social identity issues that could take place, especially when we're looking at a marginalized community like homeless people and homeless youth specifically.
Absolutely, yeah. And sort of building off your designated dollars comment, and I guess I'll ask this of Bonnie, where does the bulk of the funding come from? Is it partners, or is it stakeholders behind the scenes, or?
Sure. First, I'd just like to comment too with what Emma's saying. The other thing too, to her point about life skills, is that we, you know, having people, everybody has some sort of expertise, skill set that they bring to the table. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of purchasing those services to support our work or to be able to teach that. So in that case too, we welcome people with with skill sets to come and join and provide that in-kind service that we might not be able to purchase. So that's another way to do it. So our funding initially, we were very fortunate, like I said in the beginning, when we sort of had the idea to try and build this community collective impact approach. We approached the United Way to say, this is what we'd like to do in our community. There's the real cost for us is just having that administrative support, that one backbone person. As you can imagine, just listening to what Emma said about all the different groups and the different people involved and all the crossover and keeping us straight. I mean, that's a huge, it's more than a full-time position just to keep us going, right? To keep all these people organized and meeting and filling out our funding reports and, you know, writing our strategy to in the beginning, putting it to paper, helping us organize ourselves, work plans, all the rest. Those things, you know, that's where really we were fortunate in the beginning to have United Way fund us through a foundation that had come to them and wanted to support this kind of work. So we had a 3-year grant to be able to, and in that 3 years, our goal was to bring the community together to create an actual strategy, put it in writing, and then to start to try and implement some of those pieces. So I can say today, we're very pleased to say that we have been successful in that we've brought the community together. We have more than 25 community participants on our steering committee. We have 16 members in our youth council. We have a broad community of volunteers that are sitting on some of our subcommittees that are, you know, just other folks. So it's really growing, and we continue to want to grow that network so that hundreds of people are working together to move this agenda forward. So initially United Way, and since then we've had a lot of support from, we've had some financial support and some coaching support from the Laidlaw Foundation through Interweave, which has been very helpful for us. We've had some coaching, in-kind coaching and mentoring from Away Home Canada, because they've been in this business and have worked with other communities across Canada to do this work. So we really want to learn from others. So that's not a financial contribution, but again, going back to that in-kind contribution that really helps us. And we're right now in the process of talking to some other funding streams to see, like, whether it's government funding streams or whether it's individual private foundations, to talk about them getting involved to support our work. And what is really important is that this is not a short-term solution. So this is not something that we need sort of one-time funding and it's done. This is a long-term strategy to end homelessness. So the long-term financial gain will be great. If, you know, less kids are homeless, less kids in our system will impact us huge. But right now we need people to come to the table and say, we believe in what you're doing. We want to commit to longer term funding to help you really get there. Because our strategy goes for 10 years to 2030 is what we've targeted our time. We know that we're not going to end and prevent homelessness overnight. So we're really looking for funders, foundations, people to come to the table that understand that it's the long game.
Yeah, definitely. And I also, if I'm understanding correctly, CAMH is a pretty big part of some of the funding going into, I think it's the Buy Youth for Youth project alone, is it?
So what that is that is a funding. So the CAMH is actually doing a research project. Mm-hmm. And so what they're doing is that they're seeding youth, teams of young people to come together to create a Buy Youth for Youth project for other youth, and then they're evaluating it. So it's actually research, but in order to research it, they need to give some seed money for young people to do these projects. And so the Youth Council was able to get one of those grants through CAMH. So not only are they getting funding to seed initiative, but that initiative is being evaluated and for research purposes that will then be shared out for others across Canada as well to learn from. So, you know, it's twofold. They're not only doing good work that's going to impact our community, but we're learning from that collaboration. We're learning from their experiences so that other youth may sort of find that path a little bit easier along the way.
That sounds great. Yeah, CAMH is definitely a pretty reputable name in sort of the realm of mental health. So that's a really good partnership there. I also want to talk a little bit more about the steering committee we touched on before. So I guess I'll ask this of Emma. What kind of community stakeholder representation is there?
There is quite a lengthy list. Many people in the social service sector, that's a given. They're involved. School boards, as Bonnie mentioned, different divisions within the police, members of council, and so on. So more people in social service sectors and youth are always needed, especially now that we are establishing our working groups as well. But we do have quite a few members from 360 Kids and different shelters within York Region as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a great collection of like-minded people from honestly all walks of life. I also now want to jump into the By Youth for Youth initiative in a little more detail. Could you expand just a little bit on what it is and what you're trying to accomplish with it?
Yeah, for sure. So as Bonnie said, the By Youth for Youth project, it is funded through CAMH. It consists of basically action projects completed by individuals, the Youth Council, who have lived experience of homelessness or at-risk factors of homelessness. These individuals are all between the ages of 15 to 30 years old. And as the goal, it is for youth to partake in various learning opportunities where their creative ideas and expression is represented. Our current projects are aimed at informing homeless and at-risk youth of their tenancy rights, such as through high school workshops, a one-pager infographic, a series of 5 videos. We're starting to develop a link tree. And it's been in discussion making like a mini phone book filled with resources so we can give that to youth so they can more easily access certain services. And just a brief summary of the 5 videos that we've been funded for and that we filmed a few weeks ago. The first video, we covered what does it mean to be at risk of homelessness. So the risk factor that we kind of honed in on was family breakdown. The second video is more about what exactly is the landlord-tenant board. The third video, we talked about shared amenities that are not covered by the landlord-tenant board. For the fourth video, we talked about locks and privacy. And then for the fifth video, we talked about the Residential Tenancy Act.
Well, it sounds like great work you're doing. I think this is good because these types of videos cater to both renters and prospective renters. And I think that trying to navigate something as complex as the Landlord Tenant Board and the Residential Tenancies Act it's a really tall order. As somebody who rents, I find that as a renter, you don't often know exactly what your rights are, and they're not laid out in a very easy to understand format. So it takes a lot of back and forth, calling the landlord tenant board, kind of also trying to determine if your particular living situation falls within the parameters of that Residential Tenancies Act. I think that's kind of the biggest thing for people, especially for young persons living in the Greater Toronto area and especially in York Region, because a lot of our living situations are sort of unconventional. So a lot of the time we'll be sharing certain amenities that might put you outside the scope of that Residential Tenancies Act. But it's hard to sort of tell where you fall in that order. So I think these are really important videos that you're doing. I also wanted to just ask about something you mentioned. You brought up a link tree. Would you mind explaining what that is?
Yeah, for sure. So for the Youth Council, we've started developing a link tree. It is a new website to me as well. So I hope I can speak eloquently enough on it. But basically we also have a marketing team and a social media team within our Youth Council. So we are developing things like Instagram pages, Facebook pages, and different things for our By Youth for Youth projects. And once we have all these platforms, like we have a rollout for all of our content, we're going to be linking it onto a link tree. So people can just quickly go onto our link tree site and then see any of the different social media platforms that we are doing our content rollout on. Hopefully I spoke eloquently enough about it. Again, it is a bit of a new thing for me.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding it correctly, a link tree then is basically like a directory where you can sort of navigate to everything from it, branches, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and you also mentioned a mini phone book filled with resources. Could you unpack that a little bit too?
For sure. So we discussed this a couple of weeks ago at our Youth Council, and it's interesting because I also work at 360 Kids. I'm a peer outreach worker, and we recently did a presentation for York Regional Police. It was a homelessness curriculum, if you will, and something that they actually brought to our attention was something called an Up Your Life booklet. And it was filled with all these resources for addictions, housing, legal aid. And something that my team and I noticed that we did discuss with the police was that there were a lot of gaps in their knowledge, especially since COVID has come into place. Because an example of this would be they didn't have necessarily pages that were full enough about a good example is pets. If you're looking for housing and you have a pet, who do you call? What if it says on their website that they don't allow pets, or that they do allow pets? They may not even mention it at all. So kind of walking them through that seemingly tedious process of having to call and kind of ask. So that brings me to something that somebody else in the youth council brought up, which was a mini phone book filled with these resources. So I brought this to my youth council team as well. And I explained that this booklet already existed, but there were, again, a lot of gaps in their knowledge, which the police definitely agreed on. So hopefully down the road, we can kind of have that collaboration with the police, or YSSN, York, I think it's York Support Services Network. Okay. And they were the main creators of this booklet. So they seem very open to kind of having those youth voices heard, and establishing more relevant resources in the booklet, and ensuring that there are no gaps in anyone's knowledge, so we can support youth to the best of our ability.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I think it's a great idea to have both the information being delivered through a digital medium and having that physical booklet. Because even though it's safe to say most people these days do have a phone or some kind of electronic device with access to the internet, it's good to still have something that caters to those who don't have the luxury of that technology on hand, or maybe a Wi-Fi connection, for example. I also wanted to ask Bonnie a quick question. Does the Youth Council have plans to take on more action projects like the By Youth for Youth initiative in the future?
Sure. I think with this group of young people, 100%. I've been so blown away by their dedication to taking on more, doing more, always looking for the next thing. As Emma just said, that example right there about, advocating for having their youth voice heard to another provider who's creating a booklet. One of the things that we lack, I think, generally speaking, is youth engagement, true youth engagement, not tokenism, but true youth engagement, having young people who are using our service participating at all levels of our service. And that includes peer mentors like Emma's working for us. That includes being on youth councils and things like this. It includes collaborating with police and others who are, or other agencies who are creating tools for young people. How do we create a tool for young people without young people involved? I mean, so that's the kind of thing that we want to encourage them to continue to do. I think there's a number, the beautiful part about our strategy is it came with a ton of ideas and lots of initiatives that we feel are going to get us closer to the goals in which we have to solve, which is that prevention piece, the housing piece, the leadership, like those 5 sort of categories. Each of those categories have a number of initiatives falling out of them. And wherever we see an opportunity for either a working group, maybe the working group is with just strictly youth, like in a By Youth for Youth project, to take on an initiative, they can do that. So some of the things they could get, like awareness campaigns are great. Training, I think, is great. Another reason, because, when there's a lot of people, including school boards, that are not clear about what it looks like, what exactly are they looking for when they have students in their schools that are struggling potentially with homelessness. How does a teacher supposed to know that? You have X number of minutes in your classroom. I got the curriculum I have to teach. I've got 30 kids in my class. How am I going to notice that this kid is struggling? And that's the part we need to focus on. So when we have young people, could be people from the youth council, it might be a project, is that coming forward and putting together training curriculums for people, it's so much more moving for a teacher to hear directly from a young person who's experiencing it than from a service provider who's saying, this is what you need to look for. So we're looking at collaborating on those initiatives with the Youth Council to develop training curriculums for teachers, for administrators, to identify early signs of homelessness.
And just to add on to that really quickly too, I think in terms of trainings for educators, which is a great example, there's potential to chip away at that commonplace and rigid, quite narrow view of what homelessness looks like. For me, something that just came up when Bonnie was explaining that, when I was in high school, I was experiencing at-risk factors of homelessness, as was one of many of my friends actually, and a couple of them were actually experiencing homelessness. But because of, I don't know, the way that they dressed, the way that they acted, their academics were kind of not at the forefront. they people noticed that something was going on. It was very hard to notice that something wasn't going on. And a lot of teachers, in my opinion, and from what I saw, just kind of looked the other way, and they allowed themselves to be blindsided by it. So there was a lot of importance in giving the youth those opportunities to have workshops and courses. But as Bonnie said, too, kind of doing it from the other side and having that very vulnerable and personalized experience for educators, for example, when they're hearing it directly from the youth. Like, this is what was going on. This is what you didn't do. And this is how we can work together to ensure that this doesn't happen in the future.
I think that's a really good point. And that's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But you know, Emma, you said something now that made me, and this is where this becomes this beautiful conversation. But you know, when oftentimes teachers and others, right, we don't really experience firsthand what that homelessness looks like. So we allow ourselves to be educated by the media, and we start to think that homelessness looks like someone lying on the streets in a grade with a, you know, bottle in a paper bag, and that's what homelessness is. And so when we see a young person, we either think, oh, they have behavioral issues, or they're, you know, it's poverty, or it's something, and that's the only time they notice. But what I think, in my experience, where I found the most impact is when we bring a young person to speak who looks very much like the kid next door. You would never in a million years be able to pick them out and say, oh, that kid is homeless. They don't look, you know, like they haven't showered. They don't look scrubby. They don't look this. And when you tell their story, oftentimes people are so surprised to see the resilience in these young people. You know, I have watched young people who didn't want anyone to know they were homeless, so they would go to a community center in the morning and shower before they went to school. They would, you know, they would go to places for support to get clothing. They were very resourceful in trying to figure out how do they make it, because there's such a stigma about it, right, about being homeless, that they didn't want their peers to know, they didn't want their friends to know, their teachers to know. But there's other signs, and we have to see those signs as pathways to homelessness. So that's where the intervention happens. You don't have to wait till they get to the point where you see them not showering or not eating or what, you know, whatever. I think you have to get up where do their grades start to fall? Where do you start to see that they're falling asleep in class? Where do you start to see, that's not just because they're a teenager and stayed up late last night. Could be, but it might be something else as well. So how do we really get to know our kids so they're not just another student, but they're somebody? They have a name, they have a life, they have a story.
Yeah, and to piggyback onto that really quickly, that is the beauty, and that's the beauty of having a youth council too, because before I came onto youth council and this whole strategy, I was invalidating a lot of my own experiences, especially in high school when I was really struggling. And I didn't even know. I was completely blindsided by the fact that I was invalidating my own experiences. So having so many people from so many different walks of life on youth council that have experienced homelessness, that are currently experiencing homelessness and at-risk factors, there's potential for that kind of togetherness and even more personalized collaboration too.
And all the comments you're both making are sort of drawing me towards the conclusion that we need to rewrite the dominant narrative. And I think that comes in a few different forms, which first and foremost would be a lens adjustment to humanize people experiencing homelessness. I think a lot of the time there's this sort of disconnect between people who are not experiencing it and people who are, and that can get in the way of making real measurable change. I think beyond that, having an open dialogue between youth and older generations is extremely important, where I know Transform Systems is one of the subcommittees really taking steps to kind of break down those walls. And I think I think it was Bonnie who mentioned this earlier, was public awareness campaigns is another big one, just sort of having proper information out there to help rewrite that narrative. And then separate from that, just specialized training initiatives for educators. I know I keep referencing Transform Systems, but that's another one of the initiatives they have sort of coming down the pipes, where we're not just going to be providing a setting for youth to learn alongside older generations. We're going to be providing a setting where older generations, specifically educators, will have the opportunity to really get some formalized training about how to look for those early signs that you were both talking about. But yeah, I think there's some great stuff going on
James,
here.
Sorry, I just want to mention one last thing there around
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
because one of the things you said really hit it home for me. And I want to remind people that it's not that far away from any one of us nowadays. You know, with the cost of living increasing the way it is, the cost of
Mhm.
housing, you know, our employment rate is not keeping up with the cost of living. So the average person who was, you know, even middle class people are struggling now. So I always say to people, you know, we're all almost one paycheck away from homelessness. And so we have to change that narrative, that lens, to recognize it's not them over there. It's not those poor people over there. It could be any one of us. And that with young people especially, homelessness is not about poverty necessarily. Now, what I would say is that young people become impoverished once they become homeless, but it's not always the reason why they become homeless. We have lots of affluent families in our region who have homeless kids. And so homelessness isn't just about having no money. It's about, you know, sometimes it's about parents having mental health issues or mental illnesses and they can't properly care for their kids. It could be the young person has mental illness that isn't getting the proper treatment or support in order to, or the family isn't getting that proper support to be able to help that young person remain home. It could be addictions. Addictions are often, well, they're not often, they're always a result of something else that's missing. So people don't go just get addicted to drugs. They get addicted to drugs and alcohol because something is lacking, missing, because, you know, and then once you get there, it's a hard journey back. So we really want, that's why that prevention piece is so important. That's why we have to be empathetic to understand that these are not somebody else. Like, these are our children. These are our kids. They might not be my biological kid, but they're, as a community, our children. And we have a responsibility collectively to ensure that every young person has equal playing ground to live up to their best potential. Otherwise, we're not only failing them, but we're failing our entire system. And that failure in that system has so many longer term impacts. You know, I'll use the example of human trafficking. Everybody, now that we're sort of, it's more commonly talked about, we're educating people about human trafficking. It's not the thing we see in the movies. And we look about, you know, at the young people and we say, oh my, the victims and the survivors, and how do we put all our efforts there? But what I bring to people's attention is that people were not born to sell other people. So if we had somewhere in the lives of that trafficker, we have failed them to the point where they believe that the only option is something so morally threatening to be able to sell someone else. So do you see what I mean? The impacts later on, if we don't do that upstream work, if we don't intervene with children equitably and give every kid sort of an equal playing field to at least launch in this world, the impact is huge. And it's really unfortunate because it's just not their, sometimes it's just not their fault. You know, they got dealt what they got dealt, and it's our job to step in and give them a hand up, not a handout.
You also mentioned something there that I really resonated with, which is using the phrase "our children." And there's a saying I've heard before. I might be sort of messing it up, but I believe it takes an entire village to raise a child. And while that sentiment might not be directly about the subject matter that we're discussing today, I think there is a sort of shared responsibility that goes with that is lacking in North American culture, at least in my experience. And I think that's part of the lens adjustment I mentioned before, kind of getting back to that shared accountability and shared responsibility for our youth.
Yes, I agree. And I think it's very relevant. I think it's very relevant to this conversation because it goes back to why we're doing a collective impact approach. We can't solve this problem alone, and we can't solve it with just a bunch of service providers either. We have to be able to wrap around young people. We need to know our neighbors again. We need our neighbors to comment. We need people to step in when not, you know, sometimes, and I'll be very clear, sometimes it's not about the parents just being bad parents or not wanting. Sometimes they just don't have the resources or don't know what to do. And they too need a hand up, not a handout. And so how do we step in and assist as a village to ensure that that no child gets left behind?
For sure. I don't want to cut us off. We are running out of we are running out of time here, but I don't want to cut us off. So is there anything that either of you want to sort of add or that you feel we haven't touched on in enough detail before we conclude today's session? All right.
No, I think we've covered a lot. The only thing I would add is I think we're absolutely fortunate here in York Region. We have a number of people that are very passionate about the work, and we couldn't do it without everybody, willingness to come to the table and kick in where they can, and grateful for the young people who have utilized their life experience and put it truly to the test to make a difference, make that road a little bit easier for the kid coming beyond them. So I'm forever grateful, and that's all I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, it sounds like you're both doing some amazing work through the youth strategy. And honestly, I hope we can have you back in the future to talk about any other projects you might have in the works and just pick your brain again. But thank you both for being here. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, it's been a treat.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for having us.